have the pleasure to invite our next speaker, Professor S.P. Gautam, who has indeed had close association with Dayaji, and again probably he would be the right person to deliver Daya Krishna Memorial Lecture. Over to Professor Gautam.
Madam Chairperson and fellow speakers and friends, first of all I would like to express my deep sense of gratitude to the Indian Philosophical Congress for having given me this opportunity to be here with you and speak in the memory of Professor Daya Krishna. When in the Tirupati session, when we met after the sad demise of Professor Daya Krishna, I had suggested that IPC must honor this great philosopher and teacher of philosophy in the post-independence era by instituting Daya Krishna Memorial Lectures. I felt very happy at that time that the IPC conceded my request, but a decade ago when we were doing this, I had never anticipated that I would also be one day given this honor of remembering Professor Daya Krishna. Since at least the younger generation, many of you may not have met him, I thought that I am going to speak on a theme which was very dear to Professor Daya Krishna, that is freedom and democracy. So I have titled my lecture, Rethinking Normative Foundations of Democracy in Global Era. That is what I am going to speak on, and I repeat the title, Rethinking Normative Foundations of Democracy in the Global Era. I would be speaking in the contemporary context, but before I do that, I thought for the younger generation it might be relevant because I was fortunate that I had the privilege of meeting and listening to Dayaji when I was an MA first year student. He came for UGC National Lectures in 1972 February, and those were different times. The UGC National Lectures were supposed to be not one lecture and a person coming and delivering in a day and then moving on. The norm was that you deliver 3 lectures and stay for 5 days, and you will go to 4 universities in the north, east, southwest. So we had the privilege of having Dayaji for 3 lectures and for 5 days. So that is why I say that I was lucky. I will not be going into details of my interaction, but since February 1972 onwards, till his death in 2007, I had several occasions to be with him, learn from him, and I would like to say something about his style, both as a teacher as well as a philosopher, because that is something when we remember, a great teacher, we should be also seeing and trying to see what we can emulate. And in that context, I will say that the first thing was that Dayaji, as a philosopher, did grow up, and we should not hesitate to, say it and reflect upon it, in the colonial era. He did his master's, I think, if I remember correctly, as he told me, in 1948 from Delhi University. Then he submitted his PhD thesis, and he worked on, as people would be doing in the colonial university system, of something which was of great importance in the Anglo-Saxon world, that is the nature of philosophy itself. That is the PhD thesis he wrote, which was published in 1955. And in that book, he reflected upon the nature of philosophizing itself. And when Dayaji passed away and the ICPR organized a condolence meeting, I suggested that that book needed to be published again because it had been out of print for a long time. And I gave a photocopy, and I'm glad that ICPR did publish that book. And for the younger scholars, I'll say, please read Dayaji's Nature of Philosophy, which is his PhD thesis, in order to have some idea of, you see, the kind of PhD thesis should be written. And in that book, Dayaji very clearly suggests something, and many people who have not read the book or who have not carefully read the book ignore the fact that Dayaji speaks of the ancient Indians, that it is they who had tried to reflect upon two important questions. One is the question of self-identity, who am I, self-knowledge, and the other is, where did the world come from, what is the origin of this world. So he speaks of the Vedic rishis pondering over these questions in ancient Indian civilization. That's how the book actually begins. But since we Indians were not concerned about thinking about the nature of philosophy itself, and it was the Anglo-Saxon world which was concerned, so he moves on to the controversies, to the discussions that were going on. But ultimately he concludes something which I would like to highlight. That is, that philosophy is a self-reflective. Other disciplines are not self-reflective. This is a contrast which he put, when he was writing about other things, that philosophy is a self-reflective investigation. That is, it is constantly reflecting upon its own goals, its own aims, its own methods, its own techniques. And I think this is something which we need to take note of, because in the previous sessions, people have been talking of philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, philosophy of law, and I have earned my bread and butter most of my life doing philosophy of social sciences, though I have done other things also, but that has been my concern, that we, and this is important, that when a discipline becomes self-reflective, whether it is linguistics or law or religion or mathematics or science, it becomes philosophical. And the good thing about philosophy is that when it reflects upon itself, it is at its best. It remains philosophy, but since it is becoming self-critical, self-reflective, it is in its best form. And that is what Dayaji wanted to revive among the Indian academia, among the Indian students, that we should be constantly asking this question, that when we do philosophy, what are we doing? And in that, he came closer to what would be the analytical tradition of doing philosophy in the Anglo-Saxon world, that it is a conceptual investigation about not only received theories, but also received practices and institutions. So, reflecting upon whatever is going on around us, what you see the phenomenologists will call our lived experience. But this investigation has to be a conceptual investigation. And as my dear friend Bhagat Oinam has taken this lesson from Dayaji, and I have taken this lesson from my student, that Dayaji suggested that unless you notice a discrepancy, unless you notice some perplexity, some puzzlement, you cannot begin doing philosophy. So whether you are seeing a discrepancy which is a logical inconsistency, or you are seeing a discrepancy which is, you see, a gap between ideals and reality, or there is a discrepancy because of ambiguity. And Dayaji suggested that it is in engaging with reflection upon such discrepancies in order to overcome them, to avoid them, that we engage in philosophical investigation. And he was, you see, in that sense modest enough, suggesting that many times in trying to overcome the discrepancies, we end up with a new beginning that is creating new discrepancies. And it is for the next generation to see, and that is how this self-reflective, critical investigation remains a constant companion of doing philosophy. I remember in one of our conversations, he said that sometimes we are so enamored by something which we have admired, something which we have learnt, something which we respect, that we start taking it as absolute. But if you are a good student of philosophy, this is what Dayaji suggested to me, and I am sharing it with you. He said, imagine an adversary. And I would say here he comes closest to the Indian tradition where you think of a Purva Paksha. So imagine an adversary and see how your opponent would have tried to respond to what you are taking as an absolute. And if you imagine that, I think you overcome something which is very dangerous in doing philosophy, and that is doing bad philosophy, that when we forget that there could be a possible opponent, we start absolutizing, we start becoming dogmatic, thinking, oh, we have the ultimate final answer. The nature of philosophy is that we as humans are incapable of final absolute answers because we are finite, limited, imperfect beings. And anyone, and this is what Daya wrote in the preface of Gyan Mimamsa, a small book in Hindi, कि खड़ताल बजाइए, ध्यान लगाइए, समाधि में जाइए, करिए खुशी से, पर इसे कृपया दर्शन का नाम मत दीजिए. I think the important thing is not to say that we have the absolute answers. And Daya was doing this because of his experience. And I think that is important because this is what I discovered about him. When Daya was going to come for his lectures, national lectures, the then head of the department, late Professor Premnath, announced it to us, to students. He had to announce it to us MA first year because there was only one student in MA final. So he told us that Professor Daya Krishna is going to come, he will be delivering such lectures. And let me tell you, my good luck was, I had seen Daya Krishnaji's book in the campus bookshop, Atmaram and Sons. It was a very dusty book because it had been lying there, not being sold. So when he mentioned this, I bought it in 10 rupees and read it. And I thought when Dayaji comes, I'll be asking him questions showing that, look, you see, at least I have read something written by you. And one day I suggested to him, कि sir, मैंने Nature of Philosophy पढ़ी है, I have read your book, I would like to discuss it. And Dayaji, in his usual witty style, gave me an answer, which I would share because I have never forgotten it. He said, when one has been estranged with one's wife and is having a new love affair, the estranged wife is not discussed. So you see, this is 1972 February. He said that the nature of philosophy, which was his PhD thesis, is now his estranged wife. And I think the years which must have gone from 1951 to 1972, a period of 2 decades, is the lived experience of Daya Krishna. And since I was lucky to read his other writings, see the chronology, now what has happened is, Dayaji wrote much earlier than Peter Winch, who wrote Idea of a Social Science and its Relation to Philosophy, published in 1958, suggesting that the basic difference between natural sciences and social sciences is that social sciences are reflexive. When we are talking of human beings, we are talking of ourselves. But when we are talking of chemical compounds, physical entities, plants, animals, we are talking of others. So there is a radical difference between the nature of social studies and natural sciences. Now, there he had brought in the question of values, norms, and so on. These are very important essays, which are collected in The Art of the Conceptual, but again, which is a later publication, but these were written in 50s. And Dayaji had done it while he had been traveling in Europe and North America. But I think the West did not take him as an equal. And that is why I have chosen to speak on democracy, because democracy presupposes that we are all equal citizens. So if we have to think of democracy in philosophy, the community of philosophers, we have to start taking each other seriously, with respect, listen to each other, where I would say that perhaps I have learned this more from Guru Nanak, who said, Kichu suniye, kichu kahiye. And I would say that today, one of the problems which democracy is facing is, मेरी सुनिए, और मैं आपकी नहीं सुन सकता, क्योंकि मैं सिर्फ कहना जानता हूँ, सुनना नहीं जानता. जब तक we are not willing to listen to others with respect, with care, I think the spirit of dialogue can never be inculcated. And if, as Dayaji said, and our Upanishadic tradition said, that philosophical investigation is a dialogical investigation, is a mode of conversation about our very being, about the very meaning of our existence, about the nature of the cosmos in which we are living and our relationship with it, I think we have to bring back the dialogical mode where we are willing to listen first with care and respect, rather than all the time making noise that I have the final, absolute, ultimate knowledge and I'll give you some advantage of enlightenment if you care to listen to me. I think anyone who is unwilling to listen loses his or her right to speak, unless we respect that. And I think in the Indian context, this is the most important thing, that we have speakers and speakers and speakers. And I can see in this hall also, fortunately there are listeners, but many of them have spoken or are going to speak in the afternoon, and they do not have time to listen. I think in the Indian Philosophical Congress, we need to decide this, that we have come here not only to speak, earn a certificate for our promotion in the career advancement scheme, though I am guilty of having contributed to some of the silly things in the academic world. We must be willing to listen and understand. So, having said these things about Dayaji, that at least he encouraged us young students, he would listen to us patiently and listen to us such a patient way, but then also demolish it. I will give you only one example of a conversation which happened in my presence. A research scholar told him, "Sir, I am working on such and such thinker's theory of alienation." Dayaji said, "That's fine, but have you ever felt alienated?" And the student didn't know what was the question. He said that if you have never felt alienated, why are you bothered about alienation? You do something else. I think our supervisors also need to learn from Dayaji's approach, that we should give students the problems which they understand and appreciate than, you see, the problems on which we have worked. I was lucky to have Dharmendra Goyal, a product of Allahabad University, as my teacher and supervisor. When I was going to write my MA dissertation, I thought I should be choosing something which he is interested in. When I went to him with a synopsis, he had always given me very long comments, and he returned me that synopsis without any word written there. I said, "Sir, padha nahi aapne?" He said, "I have read it, but that is my headache, not yours. Work on your headache." This is where, you see, I would say great teachers of philosophy, you know, encourage students to find problems for themselves, to be able to work upon them. So with these words, I would like to pay my tributes to the great Professor Daya Krishnan, in whose memory IPC has decided, and I will say, please don't make it biannual. Keep him with you every time you meet, because he would be a word of caution, a word of, you see, warning, a reminder how philosophy ought not be done. I mean, he was unpopular because he always rejected those ways of doing philosophy which are non-philosophical. And you know, listening to uncomfortable things is uneasy, and many people felt uneasy because he said uncomfortable things. But I think that is where a philosopher is, that unless you are uncomfortable with yourself, you cannot start doing philosophy. That's what I learned from Professor Daya Krishnan. Now, I would say something about Dayaji, because that can be a research problem. Before I come to the topic, no, I'm aware what I'm going to do. That is, Daya Krishna wrote a book called Social Philosophy, Past and Future, where he differentiates between the Western and the Indian civilizational perspectives, and he says the West is sociocentric, the Indian is Atman-centric. At the same time, when he was writing books on Indian philosophy, particularly Indian philosophy, a counter perspective and so on, he is talking of, you see, diverse ways of doing philosophy. I would say that one problem on which somebody can think of working is, was Daya Krishnan suffering from, as you see the first book example shows, an essentialist perspective on Indian culture and civilization? Because if we say we are Atman-centric, that looks like the essence of Indian civilization. Or, as he was suggesting, that there are different schools, different ways within the tradition, and they are argumentative, they are arguing against each other, learning from each other. It looks like he was not an essentialist. But there seems to be some ambiguity. To what extent this kind of ambiguity is a consequence of the colonial context in which we want to have an Indian identity, that was the theme yesterday, and can we think of identities from non-essentialistic perspectives, or shall we be forced to think of identities only from essentialist perspectives? That is one question which I think can be an important question. And now quickly to the main theme, because this is something which Dayaji would have been very pleased that we are discussing it. When we think of democracy, whether we are thinking in the community of philosophers or in the political context, there are three things which are important. One is respecting each other's freedom. If you see, I am trying to be authoritarian, dictatorial, commanding, then I am thinking I am something superior to you, I am privileged and you need to be, beneficiary of what I can give you. This is inequality. Notice here, the two values, freedom and equality, are going hand in hand, though there is always a desire to think of which gets primacy if there is a conflict. Shall we prefer freedom or shall we prefer equality? And I would say that Dayaji thought that freedom was the source of pursuing any values. So he would give primacy to freedom over equality. But whether that itself can be a tenable position or not is something which has to be thought of. But coming back, Dayaji had written on, issues which were issues of everyday life concerns in politics. And that is where it is important. I know. That is, he wrote a book on political development. He engaged in, developmental debates. And since these days development has become our slogan, I would say please read Dayaji, who says there are areas in which talking of development doesn't make sense at all, because you cannot have any rational criteria, there will be competing criteria. Secondly, whether development in one domain will be development in another domain. For example, a country could be economically developed but morally degraded, or some country could be morally developed but economically backward. So shall we say that which one is superior, not, so on? These are the problems which one will have to talk about. So I think when people are raising questions of development, that development is our mantra, I would say take Daya Krishnan seriously, tell them we have better mantras than development. We don't need development of the kind which you want to give us, where development will bring only industry and pollution, ecological crisis. I think the important thing, which if Dayaji was speaking in today's context, would have been number one, are we allowing people respect to be able to autonomously pursue their beliefs and their ways of life? If we are putting obstructions, challenges, we are not a democratic society. Secondly, are we letting people speak what they want to speak and then criticize them instead of putting a censor on them? Dayaji will say, like Voltaire and Rousseau, I would disagree with you, but I'll defend your right to speak. I think it is the responsibility of this philosophical community today to rethink the foundations, normative foundations of democracy, and that is, speak loudly, because if you do not speak, you will be dead. And it is better to be killed while speaking rather than to die silently. Thank you so much.